Hello, everybody. My name is Masao Suzuki, and I'm giving another economic report. I'm a member of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization.
Hello, everybody.
So if you like this video, I invite you to check out a whole bunch of other videos. I saw there was upcoming ones on Puerto Rico and a year of COVID. So you might want to check those out too. Anyway, this is going to be a little bit different from my typical report because it's not mainly about the economy as much as some commentary on the recently signed American Rescue Plan that was passed by the House and then the Senate and then signed into law by President Biden just this past week. And one of the things that was significant about it is it didn't get a single Republican vote, even though it was a very popular act. Polls show at least 70% of the public and even more than 40% of Republicans supported it, and yet the not a single Republican could get up to voting for it. I think there's two things about the act I want to focus on. One, how it's really needed, because there's been a lot of suggestions, especially from Republicans, saying that it's not really needed, it's too big, et cetera, et cetera. And then also, though, where it definitely also falls short and what more needs to be done in terms of addressing the economic crisis in this country. So if we look back just on Thursday, there was the latest report, weekly report on unemployment insurance claims. The claims came in at about 712,000 for the previous week, which was a little bit lower, 40,000 lower than the previous week, but it was still higher than the all-time high before this recession started. So it's still at historic highs. And the other thing is the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, or PUA, that covers gig workers and the self-employed that are not covered by regular state unemployment insurance. New claims for that actually went up by almost exactly the same amount by coincidence the previous week. And so the total remained the same at 1.2 million people applying for unemployment benefits in just a week. Now, if we look at the total picture with unemployment benefits, that's for the week ending February 6th, the total number jumped back up to over 20 million. And so basically the numbers have been just below or above 20 million now for almost a year. And this includes both the regular state unemployment and the PUA, which I mentioned. And in addition, there's growing numbers of people on the Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation, or PEUC. And I apologize about this to the alphabet soup, but every program passed by the federal government has its own acronym. And so the PEUC, which is for long-term unemployed. Typically, state unemployment benefits only last for half a year, and the PEUC goes on beyond that. And those numbers jumped by almost 1 million people. And the same thing happened with another long-term unemployment benefit program. This is the state extended benefit program for states with higher unemployment rates. It also jumped by almost 1 million. And so I'm sorry, I take that back. It increased by a very small amount, but it did increase. And this is part of the general trend. While the pace of layoffs has moderated to only historical records as opposed to all-time records, the numbers of people who are long-term unemployed keep piling up. And so that showed up in the last jobs report for the month of February, where even though the jobs number came in better than expected at about 380,000 jobs, the number of long-term unemployed also increased by about 125,000 jobs. So what the American Rescue Plan, sometimes initialed ARP, but I'll try and avoid that. I can say American Rescue Plan without getting tongue-tied, is that the PUA and the PEUC both were set to stop taking in new applications as of tomorrow, Monday, March 15th. And then the programs would have stopped paying benefits in a month on April 15th. And so the American Rescue Plan did extend the benefits through September. And in addition, they lengthened both of the plans. So now they basically last for, well, the PUA lasts for 1.5 years, and the PEUC lasts for 1 year. So basically, unemployment insurance benefits have been extended to about 1.5 years, which is really important because the pattern of the last 2 recessions has been a very slow recovery in the number of jobs. So for example, following the financial crisis, it took 5 years for the number of jobs to get back to where it was before. And we are still at, despite a decent number last month, we're still 9.5 million jobs short of what we had back in February of 2020 before the pandemic hit. And when you count in population growth, it's more like 10.5 million people. And one of the things why the unemployment rate has been coming down, partly there is fewer layoffs and more hiring, but the other big factor is a lot of people have stopped looking for work. This is what economists call dropping out of the labor force. And if we add the people who are not looking for work, and once you're not looking for work, then the federal government doesn't count you as unemployed, even though you're not working and you'd like to work. And if we add those folks in, the actual unemployment rate would be over 9% instead of the headline 6%. Another thing the American Rescue Plan did is it extended the unemployment insurance supplement at a lower rate at $300 a month. But this is really important because, for example, here in California, the maximum unemployment benefit is about $450 a month, or $450 a week, or about $1,800 a month. And that's not even enough to afford a 1-bedroom, or actually even a 1-bedroom apartment around here in the Bay Area. And so that supplement is also badly needed. The rescue plan also opened up Obamacare and expands it. And this is really important because over half of all Americans get their health insurance from their jobs. And so, of course, when you have these massive job losses, as we've had, it means millions of people losing their health insurance. And there aren't numbers out yet on what happened in 2020. The solid numbers won't be out till September. But by all reckoning, a lot of people had to go without health insurance. And so this can help out there. Also, it helps fund a plan for people who are laid off, the so-called COBRA plan, where you can keep your same health insurance as you had before. But prior to the American Rescue Plan, it was really prohibitively expensive. And so very few people took up on it. And so now hopefully it's a little more expensive. Both of these are temporary measures until September. Let's see. Oh, one thing that is a little bit of help, but every little bit can count, is one of the things a lot of people don't know is unemployment insurance benefits are taxed by the federal government. And so the first time I went on unemployment insurance, then, the next time I was, the next year when I was filing my taxes, it was like, what? I have to pay taxes on, for my skimpy unemployment insurance benefits while I was out of work. And, anyway, actually, my first thought was probably, I shouldn't probably say it on a program where we don't have try and be family friendly and so forth. It was not fit to be said. And, a lot of people don't realize this. I know activists who, actually has ended up owing $2,000 in extra federal taxes because of his unemployment insurance benefits. And so the American Rescue Plan does count out the first $10,000 of unemployment insurance. But really what's needed is that, the federal government should not tax unemployment insurance benefits. They're generally so low and people are scraping by. So a lot of people can't afford to take the withholding out, and then they just get socked next year. Let's see what else is happening. There's some aid to renters and homeowners who are behind on their mortgages and the homeless, although this is overall a very small amount and really doesn't address the problems that we had even before the pandemic of homelessness. Millions of people were homelessness, and tens of millions of people who are just living paycheck to paycheck, in part often because their rent is so high. I just want to give a little shout out to Michaela for helping to organize this. But we had it was sort of morbid contest about who can find the highest rent in their area, because I saw social media post about a $4,000 one bed. Was it a 1-bedroom apartment, or it was yeah, and in Manhattan. And I'm like, oh, I think I can top that. And sure enough, I went online and I found a one that it was just a little bit more. It's like $4,100 for 1-bedroom apartment here in San Jose. And of course, my thinking was, boy, for that ridiculous amount of money, I'd rather live in Manhattan in San Jose. So anyway, it is a cool place to live if you can afford it. But anyway, I'm getting off track here. The American Rescue Plan increased or extended the increase in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. There goes another acronym, but it's the food stamps program. It's gone through a number of names. And again, this is temporary, only through September, and it doesn't address the issue of access to the food stamp program, because you would have thought with all these people, getting laid off and showing up in these food bank lines, a lot of people's questions, well, why didn't they apply for food stamps? But the problem with food stamps is it has work requirements. It doesn't apply to college students. And worst of all, there's a very low, you can't have more than $3,000 in the bank. And the thing is, if you're trying to, that's what some people have to save up to pay rent. Well, a lot of people around here in the Bay Area. And so if you have a choice between, not having the money for rent or not qualifying for food stamps, you'll, of course, choose to be housed. And then you end up in a food stamp line. But those restrictions, which are basically put in the 90s under Clinton as part of his so-called welfare reform, really need to be eliminated and just have a strict income basis. There's a lot of money. This is something the Republicans really hated, was there's about $300 billion sent to state and local governments. And, they try and say, well, some of the state governments aren't even running a deficit, which is true for my state in California. But the reason, why that many of these states are doing better than projected is many of them cut aggressively right at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of jobs to save money. So I know my city laid off over 1,000 workers right at the, I think it was in April or May, right at the beginning recession. Of course, that saves a lot of money, helps balance the budget. But all told, state and local governments have shed 1 million workers over the last year. And so this money can help restore some of the programs that were lost because of the job cuts. Other states, like I know California and New Mexico, just to pick a couple names that I know about, have racked up huge debt to the federal government because their unemployment insurance funds ran short of money. So I know here in California, we owed, or the state owes, $18 billion to the federal government because of there wasn't enough money in our unemployment insurance fund. And there's also a lot of, I'll be honest, I should have listened to that Republican senator who was trying to stall things and read all 600 pages of the American Rescue Plan, but I really couldn't get myself to spend hours listening to it. But there's a lot of money for institutions hit hard by the pandemic, from schools to transportation agencies to pension funds. And of course, there is a fair amount of money to help fight the pandemic directly through vaccine distribution and COVID testing and tracing and so forth and so on. So anyway, there's a lot of good stuff in the American Rescue Plan, but it still falls far short of what working people really need in this country. And so there's been a growing trend of a gap between the rich and the poor, between the wealthiest capitalists and the billionaires on one hand, and the working class on the other hand, over the last 40 years now. And this trend really accelerated during the pandemic. So on one hand, we had record numbers of layoffs, highest unemployment rate since the Great Depression. And yet last year, US billionaires increased their wealth by 44%. And it's a total gain of about $1.3 trillion on the backs of a booming stock market, rising real estate prices, et cetera. And so there are some short-term parts of the American Rescue Plan that help. Of course, there's the very popular $1,400 per person checks that actually I was balancing my checkbook today, and they had an entry, oh, your check is incoming on Wednesday. And I'm sure a lot of people are looking forward to it, in part because, like the person I mentioned who owes thousands of dollars in taxes, needs the money to pay taxes, which is sort of unfortunate that the government is giving money on one hand and then taking away from, people been unemployed on the other. It does include adult dependents, which last time had eliminated people, a whole range of adults, from college students to people who are disabled, et cetera. I know it would have eliminated, well, my father passed away, but he was a dependent of my sibling, and then he would not have been able to collect on the checks. And it also leaves out millions of undocumented who are working and paying taxes, but because they're undocumented, they have to use a taxpayer identification number, or TIN, as opposed to a social security number. So none of them are getting share of the, because the $1,400 check is actually an advance tax cut. And that's why it's coming from the IRS. And but there is a little bit of improvement, is now mixed families that have an undocumented member and a legal resident and or a citizen member, the other members of the family can collect on it. Because that was one of the most outrageous anti-immigrant things. One of the most. I mean, there's so many. it's hard to judge them from putting kids in cages to cutting off legal immigration to basically not allowing any refugees to come in. So it's hard to say. There's a whole list of horrors that were committed by Trump, but one of them was basically this guilt by association. If you had an undocumented working person in your family, then the whole family was ineligible for the relief checks under Trump. And of course, those are one-time payments. The American Rescue Plan also, for this year only, expands the child tax credit, the child care tax credit, and the earned income tax credit, which is for low-income working parents. And so it's estimated that these measures altogether could cut our very high child poverty rate of more than 14%, which means 1 in 7 children in the US were poor, officially poor, before the recession started. And those numbers were bound to have gone up. And even that 14% figure is based on a poverty line that is unrealistically low because it was developed back in the 60s. And it's really centered around the price of food. So it's adjusted every year for food price increases. But the fact is that rent and childcare, medical care, a number of necessities have gone up in price much faster than with food. So it's an unrealistically low level. And again, this is really, it's a 1 year act, so it should be hopefully extended, but that's a battle for that now we have to engage in. And of course, the most highly publicized thing left out of the American Rescue Plan was a proposal to increase the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. And the thing about the federal minimum wage, it is lagged way behind the inflation rate. So the purchasing power is a lot less than if you go back 40 or 50 years ago. So an increase is really needed. While some places, like I know where I am, the city minimum wage, or is it the county? No, it's a city, sorry. City minimum wage is over $15 an hour, but it would really benefit a lot of places in the US, especially states where they don't have a higher state minimum. So the actual minimum wage is only $7.25 an hour, which is, you know, by the way, it's our federal minimum wage is 25 cents an hour higher than the minimum wage in South Korea. And so South Korea, while its economy has developed a lot dramatically, it's not as rich a country as the United States, and yet they can afford to have basically the same minimum wage. Another thing the proposal would have done, which is very important, is right now they have an exception for tipped workers that allows them to be paid a little more than $2 an hour by their employers, which is a big boost to restaurant owners, that they don't have to pay their workers a living wage. And the rationale is, oh, but they get tips. Well, that really depends on where you work. If you work at the 3 Michelin star French Village that my Democratic governor was caught dining in during a time of restrictions, I guess it's not as bad as the horror stories that are coming out about the New York Democratic governor. But anyway, I mean, if you work at one of those restaurants that have $1,200 per person meals, yeah, I mean, your tips are going to be really substantial. But for people who are just working in regular restaurants where working people go, it doesn't come close to the minimum wage. That was another thing that would have changed but was left out. And in fact, I'm a regular reader of the Wall Street Journal just for the business and economic news. And it's always sometimes when when I'm in a better mood, I can laugh at some of the right-wing commentary in there. But they actually had an article that read, the title was "Stimulus Package is a Boon for Business," and saying, and here I'm quoting, I'm reading it, "American businesses are poised to benefit from the twin victories in the 1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief package, which gives consumers more money to spend, but doesn't force companies to raise workers' wages," right? And so I don't want to say that this is just a victory for business people and capitalists, because I think it is helping a lot of working people. But at the same time, this is, I think we should be clear, the reason why it passed is there was strong support among many businesses for passing this, especially without the minimum wage increase. And I just want to note one last thing is that it was striking to me. I read this morning a couple of an article and a commentary in my morning newspaper talking about sort of the trade-off between jobs and deaths in the COVID pandemic. And I just want to end up by saying, well, this is really a function of the capitalist system that we live off of, where the reality is there was a trade-off, you know. So California, we had harsher restrictions to try and beat back COVID, and it did result in a higher unemployment rate. But it's not a general or a truth about pandemics, because you have socialist countries like China and Vietnam, even more so, who did very well in the fight against COVID. China suffered perhaps 80,000 deaths. Vietnam far, far lower. And yet their economies were the only major economies to grow last year. So China's grew at a relatively slow for China rate of 2.3%. And Vietnam even beat that. Their economy, it was one of the world's highest, grew 2.9%. And so I think the question of the trade-off really depends on what kind of social system we live in. And so I'll just end up saying that's why I'm in the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, because I think under socialism, you don't have to trade off jobs for life. You don't have to even think about, oh, we can just sacrifice a few 100,000 old people in order to keep our jobs. And you should, I'll get to the questions, but you should check out the FRSO. And if you're interested, we have a link. I think it's FRSO/join, and we're online at FRSO.org. All right, I've given my pitch. Maybe I'll give it again at the end. Oh, this is, okay, let's start with, is there an area that this bill has completely forgotten? I think one of the things about the bill was actually sort of interesting, is that there was a very small, and I probably should have mentioned it, amount of money to look into the issue of the loss of land for Black farmers, especially in the South. And this has been a historic issue of for the last, it's been almost 100 years, where at one time there were a lot of Black farmers, but because of a combination of clan terror and industrialization, mechanization of agriculture, and also discriminatory practices by the Great Depression New Deal that had programs that were discriminatory against Black farmers. In particular, there was a program that paid white landowners to take their land out of production to try and boost farm prices. But what happened is they took of course, the land they took out of production was the ones that they had been renting to Black tenant farmers. And so that really forced a lot of them out and contributed to the great migration of African Americans out of the South into the North. And so there was a little money for that, which was interesting, but it really doesn't address the overall economic inequality that oppressed nationalities face. One of the things that was striking about the February jobs report is even though the overall official unemployment rate went down, and it did go down the most for whites, but also for Latinos and for Asian Americans. But the unemployment rate for African Americans actually rose by about 0.7%, which is still pretty significant. This, I think, just goes to show that hopefully the pandemic will be winding down, but it won't, end in and of itself the gap between the rich and the poor, between workers and the capitalists, and it won't resolve the economic inequality that exists between whites on one hand and oppressed nationalities on the other. And I think there's been a lot of press talking about, and it's true, how Black and other oppressed nationality businesses were hit especially hard, et cetera. But there's much less about how Black workers and other oppressed nationality workers were also hit again the hardest, not only by the unemployment, but also by the pandemic itself. So the rate of infections and deaths for Latinos in the US was more than twice what it was for whites. And in some areas, it could be as high as 5 times as high. And then what's worse, and we don't even know all the numbers, it's very clear that the vaccinations, whites are getting vaccinated at a much higher rate than African Americans and Latinos at least. And so I think this is something where it's, at least from my reading, and someone may point out there's some fine print and it is a 600 page bill. I hope I did make a mistake here, but I think it doesn't. It tries to address the general problem, but in the general, but the philosophy of a rising tide lifts all boats is not true, unfortunately. And so, just to help the economy in general or bring down the unemployment rate in general doesn't mean that that is extending to African American and other oppressed nationalities. And so, I would say that's probably the biggest weakness of the bill, but it's again, at least it's not like the Great Depression, where the bills were structured in a way that actually increased national oppression, increased inequality. And there may be other areas too. When I was trying to study the bill, I was just going on and on and on. It's like, wow, this is a lot of stuff. So there could be other areas that are left out. And there's a lot of other things that were not included. One of the problems that the Senate has is it has this undemocratic filibuster rule where you need to get 60 votes on most matters to settle or get a vote on a question. And so you can, if it's a budget related, you can get by with 50 because they can't have budget, the government going without a federal budget because 40 senators don't like it. But there's a lot of other things from voting rights to being able to organize. There's of course, a lot of other issues that are not directly related to COVID relief that are not in this bill, but that's for another day. And you can, of course, I'm sure you can hear about it coming up on future programs about, it doesn't deal with independence for Puerto Rico, doesn't deal with statehood for District of Columbia, which are very important in terms of, trying to remove the colonial legacies in this country. Oh dear, there's a last question here about, do I think Trump is going to run again in 2020? Well, I'm not going to stick my neck out, even though I haven't really talked to Mr. Trump in, I don't know, my whole life. So I don't know, but he certainly is putting up a big fight to keep control of the Republican Party. And I think it'll just remain to be seen what happens. Because I think whether or not Trump runs, what some called Trumpism, the sort of toxic mix of misogyny, racism, and corruption are bound to continue. And I think that is reflected in the fact that not a single Republican voted for the American Rescue Plan. And that, it shows they're, really, it's not just that they're out of touch, they don't care. They're pursuing a, ultra right-wing obstructionist path. And so I think that is going to continue. I think one of the ways Trump won't run, may not be great, is if a sort of younger version of Trump, not named Trump or Kushner, emerges to lead the Republican Party. So this kind of toxic, climate change denial. I mean, you go on, it's just hard. So I think that whether or not Trump runs, Trumpism will be there in 2024. Okay, I think I've gone through the questions. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to this, and thank you in advance for any of you who tune in later on. It's available on YouTube, where FRSO is doing upcoming programs about Puerto Rico, entitled Statehood Not Liberation, and also a report from the fight against COVID, so a year into the pandemic. What can I say? Get your shots, please. I know a lot of people aren't able to, so but when you can, do so, and let's carry on this fight against COVID, and remember that we're still going to carry on the fight for economic and political and social justice, even if, unfortunately, if the pandemic becomes a story for your grandkids about the bad old days. You can tell. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. And I'll see you maybe in about a month or so.